Hi, everyone, and welcome to this edition of Judgment Day. I'm Lorne Honickman. Well, Church of God is in contempt of court. You don't usually hear those words put together in a sentence, words describing a religious institution and legal words describing an institution or person who is defying a court order. But that is what has happened. And this is the church in Aylmer, Ontario, that faced a new set of fines just a few days ago after it was found in contempt of court, this time for a second time. And Superior Court Justice Bruce Thomas ordered $66,000 in new fines against the church, two of its leaders. And again, it was because they had openly defied court orders here in Ontario, like all across Canada, upholding the emergency health measures here during the COVID pandemic. And on April 30th, Justice Thomas had found the court had defied the orders. He looked online there. The church was streaming video of what arguably was defiance of the order, of people gathered inside, more than 100 people on one occasion. So let's talk about this. And it's because we're not just seeing these types of defiance, if I could use that, here in Ontario. We see it happening across the country. And there's a lot of things, a lot of ramifications about that. A lot of people who are very happy about it, and others look at it and say, well, wait a minute. Do we want to support these types of things? No matter what we may think about regulations, if a court has made an order, do we not say, no matter what we think of it, we have to abide by it? So I want to bring in the lawyer who represented the church and the individuals charged at the church, Lisa Bildy. And Lisa is from the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedom. And Lisa, thank you so much for joining me today. Appreciate it.
My pleasure, Lorne. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you as well. So let's go take a look at what Justice Thomas had to say. I don't have and I understand that we don't have the written ruling yet from this past Monday, but certainly we have the rulings from the previous hearings. And he basically says, and these are not very, one of the ruling with respect to finding contempt, I'm holding it in my hand. It's 3.5 pages, Lisa. It didn't take His Honor very long to find out, or to find that there was contempt of his order.
Well, no, it didn't. And unfortunately, when you're in the contempt of court regime, there are fairly limited options in terms of, the question really is, was there a court order? Did the contemptor have notice of it, and did they violate it? And so, there isn't a lot of room for all of the creative and clever arguments you might want to make about why they did it. And I certainly tried to make them. Believe me, I put as many things on the record as I could. But at the end of the day, contempt is contempt.
And we a lot of times as lawyers, we take our clients as they are, obviously, and we instruct them. But at the same time, when you see a case like this, the interesting part is that you are trying to strike the regulations down that led to the orders, but that hearing doesn't take place until down the road in October.
Right.
And your client decided, in its wisdom, not to wait until that issue was adjudicated. And Justice Thomas basically finds that despite the fact that you're going to argue that down the road, he's not going to wait. And he found that he could make the order now. Correct?
Right. Well, and as you say, you do take your clients as you find them. And we've been acting for this church since last spring already. And, this was one of our first charter challenges very, very early on after the pandemic. And of course, as you know, given the name, the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms has as its mandate upholding those very charter freedoms, such as freedom of religion, freedom of peaceful assembly, and so on. And so when these unprecedented, and they really are, lockdowns were initiated across the entire country, and of course, further afield as well, we just became immediately buried, because people could not believe that we were in the situation where civil liberties just disappeared at the blink of an eye. And so one of the first cases that I did was bring a challenge against the Aylmer police and the Ontario government over the drive-in service restrictions. So if you recall, probably seeing it in the news, this church decided it was going to meet in its parking lot, and all the parishioners were going to stay in their car with the windows rolled up. This was Easter, or around Easter of 2020, and we were in a very hard lockdown at that time, so you weren't allowed to gather in groups of 5. And it didn't specifically say in the regulations you could or couldn't do it in a parking lot, but of course, other parking lots at the mall or at the liquor store or whatever, grocery store, you could certainly sit in your car there, but not in a church parking lot. And there was absolutely no public health risk whatsoever for people sitting in their own vehicles. But somebody had complained. First of all, the police came out a couple times and said, well, this seems like a creative solution for getting your people back together. But then somebody complained. And that is what has precipitated a lot of these applications against churches, is community complaints. There are a lot of people who've taken it upon themselves to drive around on Sunday mornings and find churches with parking lots that are full and call them in. Right. So that happened with this church, and the police immediately took a heavy-handed approach. They deny it now, but I mean, the record is clear that a news release was issued saying that they were going to investigate this. They were in violation of the Emergency Management and Civil Protection Act, and this was an active investigation. And then they came out and they recorded the vehicle license plate numbers during the service. I mean, it was very aggressive, actually. And so that kind of set the tone. And here we are a year later. There have been some reprieves, given that once in a while we end up in situations where there's 30% capacity, and that seems to be enough to get people off their backs for a while, whether they're actually at exactly 30 or not. But for all these other periods of time when the restrictions are much heavier, it's led to a lot of conflict. And of course, in the community, it's escalated into a lot of interpersonal conflict as well.
Right. And where it led to, and where you're at now and where your client was at, is that Justice Thomas makes an order back in February. The order's pretty clear, or certainly I'm sure the government argued that it was very clear. I read it, and it's what they could and could not do with respect to gathering and convening. And your client live streams it. The evidence is clear. You see a church filled with people. You see a church with people standing side by side without masks, not social distancing. You're hearing a pastor basically saying, not in so many words, we're okay, this is good. And so there's no surprise, or there should be no surprise, that your clients are going to be found in contempt of an order. The evidence, and again, I'm only saying it as someone who's looking at it for the first time when I'm preparing today, but it seemed that it was obvious that they didn't really care about the order at the end of the day.
Well, they came to a point where they didn't care about the order. And so again, this is a long history now. We've been at this 15 months. I mean, that's a long time to be in this, in this situation where your rights are limited. And I think some of the religious communities feel it much more acutely than other people who maybe are comfortable with the slower pace of life and don't mind that they don't see people. But for some groups, and particularly a group like this, now remember, this is a rural, traditional congregation of people who come from a mainly Mennonite background. They grow up in the church, they marry within the church, the church is their lives. And so to tell them that they can't go to church is a pretty harsh and dramatic thing to say. Right. And so they did try to comply for as long as you might reasonably expect them to. And so, the drive-in services, after we sued, within days, they changed the regulations. So clearly they had overreached in that regard, the government had. And, then they carried on with their drive-in services. And then they did try to follow the rules as much as possible, all the way through until just after, just the end of December, when we went back into a shutdown. And there hadn't been any charges prior to that. So, to their credit, and I think Justice Thomas acknowledged that in one of the proceedings. I don't know if it made it into the reasons, but a few people got out of their vehicle. Now I should back up. Pastor Hildebrandt, speaking out as someone who was advocating for charter rights, and he's been going around to rallies, and he's become a bit of a figurehead. And like him or hate him, people have strong feelings one way or the other. So he's made a name for himself, and much to the chagrin of many in the community. And so there's actually a little group that has formed in Aylmer. They call themselves Canadians Against Freedom Rallies and Misinformation. And they come out and they park, even when the church is meeting legally, they park along the roadway in large numbers. Sometimes they make a racket with their horns or bullhorns, and they disrupt the service. These people have never been charged, by the way, even though they're not following the stay-at-home order either. The police are called out regularly because these people call in every time they see somebody get out of their car who shouldn't. So, it's not a very nice environment. The church has certainly been flagrantly disobeying, and that's obvious, but they're not the only instigators in all of this, I would say. So, yeah.
No.
But I was just gonna say, like, so they did behave for a long time, and then there were a few people who got out of their cars in December 27th, and that brought the police in, and then people got charged, and it just started to snowball and escalate. And eventually, they just said, we're drawing a line in the sand here, and you're not going to tell us not to meet to worship, and that's that. And so now we have a stalemate.
Well, it's a stalemate, but we all talk about the rule of law. We all talk about whether we like court orders or not. They're there because we need to follow them. And I'm not, and you have a debate, and I know people will talk about, well, it's different when we're talking about religious freedom, and don't tell me the story about that small business that is following the rules and they've lost their livelihood, because that's not the same as being able to worship together. And I know I don't have to tell you, Lisa, people will say, well, I don't really care about what distinction you're trying to draw here. We've all been suffering one way or the other. And if the law's out there, we got to obey it. And if we don't obey it and a court orders, we have to obey the court. And if we don't obey the court, then where's the rule of law? And what do we do about that?
Well, that's a very fair point. And, as I said, in court, as an officer of the court, obviously that is a very important factor about the rule of law, an important underlying principle, but it isn't the only principle associated with the concept, the rule of law. And, another principle is that the government should not be disobeying the Constitution, and it shouldn't be, removing everybody's civil liberties for a protracted period of time without any consideration of the charter, without any attempt to be minimally impairing, without the least intrusive means, I think is what the language used in the act. They've ignored all of that. And so the rule of law also governs those who govern us. And now that doesn't take away from the fact that a court order has been violated, but it is another texture. And the Supreme Court of Canada has said that the rule of law is a very textured concept, and there are other elements to it. And I tried to make the pitch, and of course, that was not the proceeding in which to do it, when the judge was upset that his order wasn't being obeyed. But we have to look at what the government has chosen to do here too, and they're not entirely beyond reproach. So in history, when we've had pandemics, and I remember reading an article early in the pandemic from, I think it might have been the New York Times, and it was entitled, "How Do Pandemics End?" And basically it concluded that they end when people are no longer afraid and they decide they're over. But we don't have that freedom now, because we went with this coercive and, I would say, draconian approach of telling everybody they can't leave their homes, and they can't worship, and they can't assemble, and they can't hug grandma. We've never done that before, and that was counter to all prior public health measures and plans, and it's been going on for a very long time. So we as citizens don't have the freedom to just say, I'm done with this. I'm not afraid anymore. I can see that the numbers are dropping. It's not that big of a concern to me. I have, it's a 99% survival rate. The stats are more evident now than they were in March of, of 2020, but we don't have that freedom to say that. And so the exercise of civil disobedience may become a necessary way of forcing the government to back off of what has become a protracted infringement of civil liberties.
Well, I guess the distinction, Lisa, some would make is the difference between civil disobedience and disobedience of a court order.
Right.
And it's one thing to say that we're gonna go meet and we're gonna go protest.
Mhm.
And it's another thing to say, as your client said this week, and it's on, he puts out these YouTube's videos,
Yes.
and I saw it, and
What do you
he
do,
talked,
right?
yeah, and he talked about, again, being found in contempt, and he talked about respecting the judge's orders, but he used the words, quote, "We must obey God rather than man." And that's a pastor who's putting out that message to the community, to his congregants.
Mhm.
And the interesting part of that, Lisa, is what's got a lot of components, is in Justice Thomas's decision, when he talks about his reasons for sentencing, he has a subheading there called deterrence. And he says, deterrence must be the primary purpose of my sentence. Accepting that the provincial regulations were enacted to protect the public from the spread of a deadly virus, my sentence must attempt to deter those who'd similarly ignore the regulations, both at the Church of God in Aylmer and in the community at large. Well, it appears, or we don't know, maybe the deterrent is there in the community at large. We call that the general deterrent, but certainly from a specific deterrent point of view,
Mhm.
the order isn't working, not yet, is it?
Well, it doesn't seem to be. Now we are going to probably end up in a little bit of a reprieve situation again as the weather warms and the government says, okay, you're allowed to be outside. But and so maybe that'll take the heat off for a little bit again, and hopefully we'll be done with this. But I'm not confident about that. I think that we will still be back in some form of restrictions again in the fall. They seem very sticky. I was worried about that all the way back last March, that when you're giving government a phenomenal amount of power, they don't let it go real easily. And so now so it sounds like the judge obviously doesn't have a lot of sympathy for Pastor Hildebrand and Miss Church, and that's fine. But I want to also say that the government gave itself the power under the Reopening Ontario Act to get these orders in the first place. So they ticketed them a few times. That didn't seem to be enough of a deterrence. And then they went with the order under Section 9 of the Reopening Ontario Act, which they can do without notice, by the way. And I mean, it's very hard to talk your way out of that one. They pretty much have a right to get the order. So then your hands are tied. So really at no point along the way here can you even have a discussion on the merits of whether this is appropriate, constitutional, etc. So we are going to do that. We brought a motion to set that order aside, but as you said, we aren't going to get to hearing it until October. We're now joined with a few other churches, and it's taking a while.
And by that time, and I'm going to say, not that I don't want your case to have any significance, but I will say this: I hope by that time it isn't significant, in the sense that that the world has changed. Certainly, we've changed here in Ontario, and things are open by then, and that your client is allowed to have services as it did before, and perhaps your application will strictly be done for the purposes of clarifying the law in the event a pandemic happens again. So I'm hoping that your client is able to do what it can't do now. But I do want to ask you one question about that. Your application is obviously not the first since the pandemic began. I'm not even talking about from a religious point of view. There's been charter challenges all over the place. Correct me if I'm wrong. Most of them have failed since the pandemic began. Most of them have been dismissed.
Yes, I've been following them all pretty closely. I don't think there's been a winner yet, but to be fair, most of them have been injunctions. And so of course the burden is different, and that you're looking at a different calculus. And so those have all been, even though in most cases the courts have recognized that there are charter issues at play, and there is a discussion to be had. That isn't the place for it, and the injunctions have failed on the basis that the public interest means that we should be taking a more cautious approach, right? There was a judicial review out in BC that some members of my team at the Justice Center were involved in, and that was a partial success. They struck the restriction on outdoor gatherings for peaceful assembly, but the church's restrictions remained in effect. Now, again, though, that was a judicial review. So the test was, were we in the realm of reasonable options as opposed to was the decision correct, right? So
little different.
Yeah. So as far as a hearing fully on the merits, I think there's only been one that's been released so far, and that was the one out in Newfoundland. And that was very early on. That was like April that was heard of last year, and that was the mobility rights one that the CCLA had brought. And I don't think they put any scientific evidence forward. It was just kind of a, this doesn't seem right. The Constitution must mean something, and the precautionary principle was raised, and that one was dead in the water. I think they've appealed it. I don't know where the status is right now. And then we had Roman Baber had a case that was argued just a couple of weeks ago on the merits of outdoor gatherings in Ontario. So I don't think that there's been a decision on that one yet.
Yeah, we're waiting for that one. So now just tell me, just before I let you go, Lisa, about the about Church of God. What are the total fines right now that they're facing?
So the original contempt proceeding, which was May 14th, that was when they locked the doors too, by the way, of the church. That was 117,000, I think. And that was payable in 90 days. And then they had another one 2 weeks later for $66,000. So it's very expensive.
Very expensive. And they locked the doors, correct?
They did lock the doors, yes.
The doors. And have you filed notices of appeal? Or is that coming, or are you doing that?
On that, no, we have not. On locking the doors, no. We have a term in the order that once it gets to be 30% capacity, then we can revisit it on 2 days' notice. Okay. So that's the
all right. Well, according to your client's latest video, they're going to be congregating again in a couple of days. We're talking on Friday, and they said so we'll see what happens and how long this will go on. But it is a very interesting discussion dealing with the issue of court orders in this pandemic and people such as your client that appear to say thanks but no thanks.
Well, it is interesting, and we take our clients as we find them, right? So
I think I said that at the beginning.
I'm just going to bookend it with that.
Yeah, that's okay. All right. Well, Lisa, thank you so much for joining me.
My pleasure.
Appreciate it. And we obviously will be following the story very closely, and as well as when you take this case in October, and the constitutional challenge is heard on its merits. So we'll talk soon. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye.
And that was Lisa Bildy, who is lawyer for the church and for the individuals, including Pastor Hildebrand. And of course, Lisa's from the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedom. We were talking about the different proceedings across Canada. And like I was saying, that it's not only here in Ontario. A few weeks ago, out in British Columbia, there was a finding of contempt against an individual out there who runs a restaurant out in British Columbia on Vancouver Island. And there were orders against that particular restaurant, and there were several types of orders that were dealing with things that were outside of the COVID emergency health measures, but there were also orders from the court as they related to COVID, including barriers between tables and all sorts of things about having her restaurant open. And this was just a few weeks ago, and there was an injunction that was brought in April to stop her from being able to do what she was doing, and most importantly, for her to quote, comply with COVID orders. And just like we saw what happened with the Church of God here in Ontario, it was found that she breached all of those orders, and they found that she was in contempt of them, and said, again, like here, there were no mitigating factors, and she was fined $4,000 in relation to the breaches. Now, not quite as expensive as what's happened here in Ontario with the Church of God. So we're seeing these types of things all the time. Out in Nova Scotia a few weeks ago, there was going to be an anti-mask rally that was going to take place there called Freedom Nova Scotia. So the government went to court out there to try and get a preemptive injunction. We don't even see these types of injunctions where saying we believe there's going to be non-compliance with the orders. Judge went out there. Judge went and heard all of this and granted this injunction to stop this rally with respect to the numbers that was supposed to be there. And he went through all the law, looked at it, and basically said that yes, they could get this injunction to stop the transmission of COVID. The judge put out some clear language about who could be there and not be there. And the next day, if you take a look at the stories that took place there, Halifax Regional Police issued 21 tickets, made multiple arrests, 2 separate illegal gatherings there in Halifax, one day after the Nova Scotia Supreme Court issued their temporary injunction to stop the weekend anti-mask rally in the city. And so basically, again, those people, like the people here at the Church of God, like the restaurant out in Vancouver, just basically said, yeah, we understand a court order, but in defiance of the court order, they did what they wanted to do. And it really is, I'm not going to go as far to say troubling. I don't want to exaggerate. But you heard when I was talking with Lisa. I understand civil disobedience. I understand the purpose. I understand the purpose to allow freedom of association, freedom of speech or expression, as we call it in Canada. It all is, it's been written about, it's been debated, it's been talked about, it's accepted. It's part of who we are. We have to be allowed to be able to do that. But we live in extraordinary times, and perhaps regulations and laws that have been put in place, and now we're into whatever it is now, we lose track, 16th month, 17th month of this pandemic, and lockdowns, and it's been frustrating, and messaging by all levels of government have been awful. Awful is probably too kind to all levels of government when we talk about the messaging of what you can do and can't do. But at the end of the day, we do have laws in place. And perhaps when we look back and we're, God willing, I'll say that, and God willing, one day we're able to look back at it all and do a full debrief and analysis and say, wow, did these governments go way overboard in these regulations? And yeah, they really did infringe our rights, left, right, and center. But they were the laws that we live with in a free and democratic society. And almost more importantly, to me anyway, speak for myself, is we have given judges the ability and the constitutional laws to look and apply the law. That's why they're judges. And if they make orders, whether we like them or not, there's ways to dispute judges' orders. Those are appeal courts, and that's why they exist. But to simply go out and say, okay, yeah, I respect that. Yeah, he or she's a judge and judge's order, but hey, we're just not going to follow it because we don't believe it. And we don't believe it should be there. And we are really upset that we have to follow any of these orders. So we're just going to defy the orders. Something about that for me puts a bullet into the rule of law. You know, the stake through the heart of the rule of law. And I can't, in my own mind, I can't reconcile or condone it. So I understand the frustration. So we have to wait and see what people are going to do. But we're seeing this now. Judges make rulings and people go, who cares? I don't think that's really the way we need to go. But I guess we'll wait and see. And like I said to Lisa, hopefully all of this will be over soon. We'll all be back out there doing what we want to do, what we feel we have the right to do, and we can look back and analyze this at some point in the future, hopefully soon. All right, that's this edition of Judgment Day. Thank you so much for joining me, and I will see you next time, and we'll analyze some more court decisions that affect our lives from one end of the country to the other. Bye, everyone.